We'll open in prayer. Let's begin in the name. Let's begin in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All I have and call my own, you have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. We have 4 objectives today. By the end of class today, you should be able to do these 4 things. If by the end of class you cannot do these 4 things, then I have failed you as a teacher. I'll do my best. Please do your best. Would somebody like to read number 8, please? Thank you, Billy. Yes, so the Civil War is not only the great storyline of the first semester, it's the transformative moment for our country. There's actually even a rhetorical shift that happens as a result of the Civil War and the way that we think of what our country is. Before the Civil War, it was common to refer to these United States, which emphasizes the collective units. To after the Civil War, you find that people refer to the United States as if there is a single country. It's like the thing that changes the way Americans look at our country. So it transforms the national economy to create a stronger nation state. Would somebody like to read number 9, please? Thank you, James. Yes, so in our last class, it's been so long ago, but in our last class, we started the Confederacy and made an attempt at a country. We will talk about how basically the Confederacy starts out with some real leadership problems and just the burden of carrying a war they were ill-equipped to fight. And would somebody like to read number 10, please? Thank you, Aaron. Very good. So this is a good APUSH term for us, the turning points. That's a good piece to go look for in any kind of a storyline where it looks like something is happening one way with a predictable end, and then suddenly there's a turn and it goes in a different direction. This is a good APUSH skill, and it's one of the classic things that the College Board will look for, identifying turning points and how they affect the outcome of any particular storyline. And would somebody like to read number 11, please? Thank you, Matthew.
Identify the most important wartime rehearsals for Reconstruction.
Yes, so the Civil War, for all of its weight and import and like sad and important storylines, Reconstruction becomes at some point the focus of the way the war is going to go. When the war is over, how will the country relate to its parts? And some of the pieces of the Civil War kind of foreshadow the way that Reconstruction is going to go. So when you go home tonight and your parents say, "What did you learn in school today?" you don't have to look at them and say, "Nothing," like you've been saying since you were 8. Instead, you could say, well, Father, shall we explain how the Civil War transformed the national economy and created a stronger nation state? And they'll say, "Why, yes, child, that'll make a thrilling dinnertime conversation. You'll have something to talk about. How exciting will that be, huh?" So super exciting indeed. Woo!
The war is actually super interesting.
It is, I agree.
Okay, that is a really cool picture.
Yeah, I like it. All right, so let us begin in Roman numeral number 8. And where is my packet? There it is. Roman numeral number 8. So the Republican Party, members of the Republican Party saw anybody who criticized the war effort or Lincoln's policies as basically the equivalent of treason, people that would do that. This is not an uncommon thing in America in times of war, that you're expected to totally support the war effort, and anybody who doesn't totally support the war effort is like un-American or treasonous. Yes?
Is it like during World War I, or I think World War II, when they had the Sedition Act or whatever?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
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 That's true, and it's a pretty common thing, and you know, we see it in American context. It's true in a lot of countries that in a time of war or national crisis, you're expected to be totally, wholly, 100% American, and any criticism is seen as anti-American. Now, while we're talking about free, I mean, you have the right as a person, you have the right to an unpopular opinion. But sometimes it comes with some of the social pressure that you're not allowed to act it out. Likewise, you know, this is the great Eric Foner storyline here about what is freedom. Abraham Lincoln took some, I think, questionable, and all in all, I'm a big Lincoln fan, and I think most people are. But if there is a criticism of Lincoln's work during the Civil War, it's that he suspended twice the writ of habeas corpus throughout the entire Union for anybody accused of disloyal activities. All right, Latinists or future attorneys, tell me about habeas corpus. Yes?
Isn't it like the right to like be church filed?
Sort of. It's related to that. Yes?
The right to not be arrested until you've been officially convicted or like indicted for a crime.
Yeah, a person needs to be charged with an actual crime. If we think that Kean is being annoying, we can't just go throw him in jail and then figure out why we're throwing him in jail later.
Like kind of like how we have the Miranda rights now.
No, I mean they're both protections of accused, but they don't function the same way. Habeas corpus means that if a person's going to be thrown in jail or be arrested, they must be accused of an actual crime. It's a Latin phrase that means produce the body. If you're going to charge somebody with murder, there actually needed to be a murder committed. Go show me a corpse. Go produce a body, and then we'll try to charge somebody. We can't just, you know, Kean is apparently being annoying and disloyal. We'll throw him in jail just to get rid of him. That's a habeas corpus violation. And I think this is a fair criticism of Lincoln that he suspended those protections twice, kind of under this banner of don't criticize the country in a time of war. After the war, the Supreme Court made it very clear that the Constitution doesn't get suspended in wartime, that constitutional rights even apply when it's difficult to do so. Though I think it's also fair to remember that Lincoln wasn't a despot. He wasn't a dictator. This is sometimes what you'll hear about Lincoln, that his detractors, and there are people that are anti-Lincoln. I've met a few that are not like racist Confederates or anything, but that criticize his things like suspending the writ of habeas corpus. But he does show that sometimes your civil liberties have an end to them, and there's an edge to them, and they could be curbed for demands with patriotism or national unity, whether legally or extra legally.
Mr. Wahlberg.
Yes.
Have you read Killing Lincoln by Bill Wright?
I have not.
It's really good if you're a Lincoln fan. It's very, very interesting.
Okay, subpoint B. In the North, the rising class of capitalist entrepreneurs gained power, particularly in the North, which experienced the war as a time of prosperity. It was a good time to be basically in industry or related to the war effort. Entrepreneurs just, in a time of war, people buy stuff. They need things. Government needs stuff. Farmers need stuff. They need to make bullets and guns and uniforms and Congress adopted policies promoting economic growth, and it permanently altered the financial system. For example, the Homestead Act gave 160 acres of land to settlers in the West, and the Land Grant College Act established agricultural colleges to go promote growth. So those aren't necessarily like directly related to the war effort, but they're kind of in the broad picture of the way that the economy transforms in this time. Subpoint C. For Native Americans, the war was I don't know, increased conflict. Basically, the intensity and pressures of the war was carried out on Native Americans. Notably, there were Sioux Indian attacks in Minnesota that killed hundreds of white settlers until the army had to be called into Minnesota to go subdue the attacks. And the reaction from Colonel Chivington, whose massacre of Cheyenne and Arapaho in Colorado, I guess it's not strictly speaking a reaction because it happens in a different place, but the massacre of the Cheyenne and the Arapaho at Sand Creek, Colorado, where 400 Indians were killed, kind of like the Sand Creek massacre is sort of unprompted. It's like a question of territory dispute that ends up with Chivington just killing 400 people.
So there were a bunch of Sioux Indians like attacking people, so their solution to it was to go kill a completely unrelated.
No, that they're not. They're kind of in the same time. So you find so much of the time that Indians are just grouped together as Indians. There's not really a distinction made between different peoples and different tribes. And killing Indians someplace is killing them anywhere. So I don't think we can say that the Sand Creek massacre was a reaction to the Sioux in Minnesota. But it's kind of like this broader anti-Native American sentiment. A Union campaign against the Navajo people led to what's known as the Long Walk, where the Navajo were removed to a reservation, basically forced out of their area to another one. And just the turmoil of the Civil War carried over to a vulnerable population here. Now, the Confederates treated Native Americans a lot better than the Union government did. The Confederate Constitution actually allowed Indian tribes to go elect members to the Confederacy's Congress. And slave-owning tribes like the Cherokee sided with the Confederacy to do so. Subpoint D, to go pay for the war, there needed to be some pretty dramatic changes in American financial policy, including tariff protection and new excise taxes. We find America's first income tax is created during the Civil War, and the old practice of selling war bonds. A bond is the way a government borrows money. It is still used today. Not specifically a war bond, but governments issue bonds all the time. But a bond is a way of borrowing money. So you could buy a $100 bond. Maybe Spencer's going to go buy a $100 bond, and he gives $100 to the government to go buy this piece of paper. The bond has a certain maturity date, that at the end of its maturity, he gets the $100 back plus the interest that's accrued. Bonds don't usually make a ton of money, but they're seen as very, very safe investments. But they do earn money. They do earn income, but they're seen as very safe investments.
Because if your government collapses, you're going to get your money back.
Probably, yeah. I mean, you can reasonably assume so. It is theoretically possible the government could declare bankruptcy and default on other bonds, but they probably won't. They probably won't.
Not be happy.
Right, yeah. You'd have real turmoil. So to pay for the war, they've got to come up with new funding measures to go make that happen. The other ways that there's like civic involvement in funding comes from a thing known as, and I don't understand the origin of this name, the sanitary fair. And I've only been to a few fairs in my life, and I wouldn't call any of them sanitary, so I don't really understand the naming of these things. But they happen where hundreds of thousands of women in the North took part in humanitarian organizations. Women played a leading role in organizing these sanitary fairs. Also working as nurses and factory workers and government clerks. We see that the Civil War raises the profile of women who had been already an increasing profile with the abolitionist movement in the public rhetoric, but here emerge as a major player. Northern women were brought into the public sphere, and war work offered them the taste of independence. And here I'd like to introduce Clara Barton. Clara Barton, the president of the American Red Cross. She's the foundress of the American Red Cross, Clara Barton. She's also, this is fun Scholars Bowl trivia here, the only county in Kansas named after a woman is Barton County, named after Clara Barton, who never visited it, but they just wanted to honor her because her work with the Red Cross was so awesome. And lobbied for the United States to endorse the Geneva Convention for treatment of prisoners, but also activities in the war in 1864.
Mr. Walter?
Yes?
So for the Geneva Convention, was originally just the United States thing?
No.
Oh, so it was original. It was
So the Geneva Convention in 1864 was about basically the prosecution of a war, and she argued that the United States should join the convention and join the propositions there. Yeah. Republicans called any war opponents what were known as copperheads. So a copperhead was a person that was against the war. And it becomes that a person in protest of the Civil War would affix a penny to their lapels. They'd make a little lapel pin or tie it to their coat lapel. The penny at the time had Lady Liberty on the front. It didn't have Abraham Lincoln yet because he's still alive, but has Lady Liberty on the front. And so they said that the Civil War was an unjust intrusion, I suppose. I don't actually understand the symbolism here as well as I should. But they were called copperheads. Anybody that opposed the war, and it was kind of an insult to be a copperhead. Yeah. The war also heightened existing social tensions and created new ones. The Civil War was the same time as the New York City draft riots. Irish immigrants ended up leading an angry mob targeting draft offices and industrial sites, and also the city's black population, whom they blamed for economic insecurity, but also the Civil War. And they have, like, the Unionists to come send in troops to New York City to put down the draft riots, to go stop the uprising. Roman numeral number 11. Not right now. We'll just stop there. Yeah. Okay. All right. Roman numeral number 11. So in the Confederacy, President Jefferson Davis, this long, gaunt-looking man on the left, Jefferson Davis, the president, proved unable to basically communicate the meaning of the war, what it meant to be a Confederate. It was hard to put it rhetorically in a way that would apply to ordinary people. So the South has slaves, but remember, most people in the South aren't slave owners. So if you couch the Confederacy in terms of like the right to own slaves, that actually doesn't apply to too many people. They might theoretically appreciate the right or profit from the right, but it still doesn't mean much. And his inability to communicate the grand rhetoric, the grand themes of the Confederacy, led him to be very unpopular. And I think Jefferson Davis kind of knew that ahead of time. There's a lot of Hershey Kisses here. That is a lot. Yes?
Was it a popular opinion of just like the general population in the Confederacy that they wanted to see it, or was it just like the government, they were just like, you know what, we're not paying attention?
That's a hard question to answer. A lot of people in the South who fought in the Civil War, they don't have a financial interest in slavery. They're not slaveholders. But they have sort of a homeland interest in the Confederacy. You take like Robert E. Lee, who under different circumstances wouldn't have been the great Confederate general. I mean, Robert E. Lee's father fought with Washington, in the American Revolution. So,
Didn't he also like hate slavery?
yeah, but he's a Virginian, and he said that he was fighting for his country, and his country was Virginia. So there's a certain amount of like regionalism and sectionalism that goes into it, that the economics of slavery, the protection of it matters, and it's the reason the Civil War is fought. But it's not necessarily the motivations of every person fighting in it.
So it was less like, we're part of the United States of America, we want to, fight for our country. It was more like, I'm a part of Virginia, I'm a part of, New York or whatever. I want to fight for my individual state.
Well, we just can't paint with that broad of a brush. The war is fought over slavery, and And you should be real suspicious of anybody that says otherwise. The war was fought over slavery. But it's always more complicated than that. You know, and you've also got America redefining itself. I mean, like I said earlier, it's the shift from these United States to the United States. It's kind of it's an identity crisis. It's a country facing an identity crisis.
Call ourselves Americans, not Kansans, right?
I don't know. I think of
Like, we're not, like, if someone asks, like, what country we're from, don't say we're from Kansas.
there's 300 million people in America. I can't answer for all of them.
Sure enough, yeah. But in general, we usually would call ourselves
I
Americans.
think you're speaking for yourself here, Matthew. I don't think you can make an in general statement.
Sure enough.
All right. Subpoint B. I need to mention this before you move on. The Confederates, their greatest strength is that they hold such an economic power in cotton. They have King Cotton, right? And the Confederates tried to use their power of King Cotton to go pressure other countries to side with the South. To do so, they tried to strong-arm their trading partners by basically cutting off supplies to Europe. They're thinking like, to make sure that Europe doesn't side with the Union, European countries don't side with the Union, to force them into that position, they're going to use economic measures. Say like, you know, hey, you buy a lot of our cotton, it's obviously an important import to you. And if you recognize our enemies and you don't recognize us, then we're going to cut off this important line to you. Now, you might right away see the problem here, and that is that it's basically the only thing the South does for money is sell cotton. And if they refuse to sell cotton to their major trading partner, then they're kind of like cutting off their own nose to spite the rest of their face. So the effort failed, and Europeans actually, they had a fair amount of raw material cotton, but had other suppliers as well. Cotton grows in other parts of the world. I mean, the South, American South, this is still true today. American South makes the best cotton in the world. But there are other places that make it, and in a pinch, you can use Indian cotton or North African cotton. There's other choices out there. Okay, so point B. The South, the Confederacy, had a lot of social change and turmoil that embroiled it. The draft encouraged class divisions among white people. Wealthy slave owners received draft exemptions if you had more than 20 slaves. If you had 20 or more slaves, then you could be exempted from the draft because obviously you're managing a pretty important plantation and the South needs the plantations to keep going. So 20 or more slaves means a person didn't get exempted from a draft. So the result is that the Confederate troops were made up basically of people that are not men of means. It was accused as being the rich man's war, but the poor man's fight, because the rich men didn't have to go fight in it, but it was being fought to protect their interests. Subpoint C. The South's economy, unlike the North, fell into a full-time, wartime crisis. Yeoman families went to the war to preserve their economic independence, essentially fell into poverty and debt. Because the South had no substantial industry outside of cotton production, once they cut off from the North, they lose their great supply, like food. They're just not growing a lot of food. It's farm country, but all the farm is cotton, and you can't eat any of it. And they've just lost their big trading partners, both in the northern industries and now the European economies. So there was like just a full-on food and money crisis in the South. And so it's no surprise to me that by the last days of the war, 100,000 Confederate soldiers just deserted they just left. They just left their ranks, laid down their rifle, and walked into the back country to go find some food because they're just in crisis. Subpoint D. So in the North, women have a greater emerging role, things like the American Red Cross. In the South, things don't go as well for women in the South. Even more than in the North, the war placed unprecedented burdens on Southern white women. The women were left to go manage the farm and the slaves, and most were wildly unprepared for the task. Whereas men were raised in the culture of management and agricultural business, women were not. They were raised as southern gentilities, southern belles that weren't to concern themselves in the management of the house. So woefully unprepared for the task. The war also led to a political mobilization of non-slaveholding white women because of their growing dissatisfaction. Civil War is also an era of great letter writing, where Southern white women were writing to their husbands about all of the troubles in the war, and the homesick soldiers finding out how hard their wives and mothers and sisters had it back on the farm, led to a real decline in the morale of the army and encouraged desertion from the army. Roman numeral 10. When Robert E. Lee advanced into northern soil in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania is the site of Gettysburg, where the Gettysburg Address is, right? And Robert E. Lee makes a raid on Gettysburg. It was entirely an unnecessary battle. The Confederate soldiers were so poor that they didn't have shoes. They would go into a battlefield and go pick the uniforms of their dead comrades to go put on their shoes and their coats. So they didn't have enough uniforms to get everybody. They didn't have enough footwear. They had to go pick up the rifles in the field because there weren't enough rifles, and they had to go find the bullets of the fallen soldiers and go load their own guns with it because there just wasn't enough. They had to scavenge from their own comrades. There was a rumor that Gettysburg, which is not an important city then or now, had a warehouse full of shoes that were there for distribution. And the Southern troops basically pressured Lee into go attacking on this city because they just needed supplies. Strategically, the South has no interest in the North. They just have to keep from losing. They don't need to win a war. They don't need to advance into the North. They just need to protect their border. But they go make the raid on Gettysburg. And when Robert E. Lee advanced into northern soil, he was held back by Union forces under the command of General George Meade at the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. Lee ordered Pickett to go charge up the hill towards Gettysburg and go take the fort. It's known as Pickett's Charge. It's considered Robert E. Lee's greatest blunder. We just kind of talk about battlefield tactics for a minute. So you have Gettysburg, and you have, the Union up at the top, and you've got the Confederacy at the bottom, and they've got to go charge up the hill to go take this. Pickett is ordered to go lead the charge up the hill. This is a terrible tactical position to be in, where people are shooting down at you. And what's known as Pickett's Charge is Lee's greatest blunder, and it was basically a massacre. Pickett was ordered to go into this, and he's like, really? Robert E. Lee, do I have to? Because this looks like a suicide mission. And Lee was desperate and said, we need that hill. We need you to go take it. Pickett's Charge was ordering people into their demise. Gettysburg was an unexpected battle that didn't have to happen and resulted in a very bloody end. Around 50,000 people were killed at the Battle of Gettysburg. It was the costliest battle, and I think remains the costliest battle in American history. It's insane. Now, so the Civil War remains America's bloodiest war. We lost more people in the Civil War than we did in any other conflict because both sides were Americans, right? The Civil War was also, there was a new technology. There was a new rifle. I think we'll talk about this soon. Rifles were far more accurate than any previous weapon, but the battle tactics never changed from before rifles. All right, so imagine in your head what the American Revolution looks like, where the British all wear red uniforms and stand in a straight line and shoot towards the American side, which, although there is guerrilla warfare, also tended to wear blue uniforms and stand in a straight line and shoot towards the other. That style of warfare totally makes sense if your bullets aren't very accurate. Your only chance of hitting your opponent is if you stand shoulder to shoulder with the person next to you and just send over a volley of lead slugs, and hopefully someone is going to hit somebody. With rifles, that changes, where guns become extremely accurate. But if you still line up in a straight line and shoot on the other side, you just line up for massacres, and then you stand there and take it when the other side returns fire. Battle tactics hadn't changed, but the battle technology had. And so the Civil War just became a very efficient way of mowing down Americans. It was really terrible, really terrible. Gettysburg was an unexpected battle with a bloody end. At the dedication of the Union Cemetery in November of 1863, Lincoln used the moment to redefine the war. Lincoln insisted that the war wasn't about punishing the South, but it was about unifying America with the principle that all men are created equal. A term which he can't find in the Constitution because it doesn't exist there. That all men are created equal is pulled out of a piece of rhetoric from the Declaration of Independence, which is not a legal document, but it becomes America's favorite document. And part of the reason it's the favorite is because Lincoln uses it in the Gettysburg Address, in what is the most beautiful, tight 3 paragraphs in American rhetorical tradition. In Vicksburg, Mississippi, in July of 1863, Ulysses S. Grant won a Union victory there, and Vicksburg was the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Grant held siege on the city for 6 weeks until, facing starvation, the city surrendered. So in 1864, Ulysses S. Grant began a war of attrition against Lee's army in Virginia. Okay, so Lincoln really struggled to find good leaders. Lincoln had a real problem struggling to find generals who could successfully command the troops. They started out with McClellan. McClellan would assemble, I'm not kidding by this, millions of people under his command right along the Potomac River, but would never cross it to go advance into the South. Lincoln fires McClellan and then tries a couple other generals, and he just can't get any traction until he finds Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant had fought in the Mexican Wars, not successfully. He was a very below average soldier. He had tried business without any success. Grant looked like he kind of failed at everything until the moment he became a Civil War general. And then suddenly it's like the clouds parted and he sees the battlefield differently than everybody else. And so when Grant takes Vicksburg, Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, he basically cuts off the Mississippi as a means of transportation for the South. You'll remember that the South doesn't have a lot of means of transportation. They do not have a well-developed railroad network. That their most significant river is the Mississippi River. But now when he takes Vicksburg, he stops off north and south traffic. So it's pretty crippling when he takes Vicksburg. And he takes it by laying siege to the city. It's like Joshua and Jericho kind of stuff. Like they surround Vicksburg. Vicksburg has got its back to the river, but they cut off transport in and out, and they don't let anybody in or out of the city of Vicksburg. So when you lay siege on it, you just surround it and don't let anybody in or out. You're just like, be in there and starve, bucko. And so he just laid siege to Vicksburg and cripples them, and they're starving to death in the city. But he forces their surrender. When he does that, he takes the Mississippi River. I would argue that Vicksburg is like the first of the great turning points of the war. So when he does that, it allows the North to consider a winnable war. So after the capture of Vicksburg, so they began a war of attrition in Virginia. At the end of 6 weeks of fighting, Ulysses S. Grant's casualties stood at 60,000 people. Imagine losing 10,000 soldiers a week. Good gravy. But that was almost the size of Robert E. Lee's entire army. So Grant had lost more of his soldiers than the entire South had. Robert E. Lee had lost 30,000 people in 6 weeks of fighting in 1864. By the fall of that year, Grant began a siege of Lee at Petersburg. Help me find Petersburg. Vicksburg, here. Is it on this map? It's not on this map. Okay. So he begins a siege at Petersburg. This is where I want to introduce William Tecumseh Sherman, this guy on the bottom right corner. William T. Sherman entered the city of Atlanta. So when Sherman goes down and takes Atlanta, he takes what is the South's rail hub. There were a couple of important cities in the South. The South doesn't have a lot of urban areas. New Orleans is the biggest city of any kind of importance. After that, you've got Charleston, Chattanooga, Vicksburg, Richmond, Atlanta. There's just not, and even though those aren't what you would think of as like cities in the urban sense, but when he takes Atlanta, he basically takes the rail hub, which means the North cut off their river traffic and is now stopping their railroad traffic. He sees Georgia's main railroad center. 1864 is also an election year, and Lincoln is up for re-election. And the Republican Party is divided. The Republican Party is divided between two camps. On one side, you have the radical Republicans that are like dramatic anti-slavery, and then you have the conservative Republicans who are like end the war and bring peace, like stop this stuff. Well, anyway, the radical Republicans did not see Lincoln as effectively prosecuting the Civil War, and they want to nominate a battlefield hero. And so some radical Republicans split in the party and nominate our old friend John C. Fremont to run against Lincoln in the Republican Party at the primaries. And they call for a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery, which Lincoln isn't calling for yet, federal protection of freed people's rights, and the confiscation of land from the Confederates. The Democratic candidate for president was General George McClellan. Lincoln's first great general is now running against him in election in 1864. Yes, now McClellan has his supporters today that says he actually wasn't a disaster general, that history has been written by pro-Lincoln advocates. I don't think the history backs that up, but I'm not a historian, I can't claim that. Lincoln won the election in 1864 for two reasons. One, John C. Fremont withdrew from the race. He originally thought that he would challenge Lincoln, but decided he was unwinnable, so he withdrew from the race and supported Lincoln. That helped. And then two, Lincoln finally gets a major victory when Sherman takes Atlanta, and it changes the dynamics of the 1864 election, and Lincoln squeaks out a win. Yeah.
How much did the people from the North and the South know about what was going on with that?
So it was fairly well covered by the newspapers. I don't know if we get this in this day or another. No, we get it in a different day. It's the era of photography and great photography. People taking pictures of the battlefields and running it in the newspapers, and it was fairly well known. I mean, at least for 1860s communication technology, people were familiar, and it's an era of letter writing, so people were writing letters back to the front. So there's always a little fog of war, but it was fairly well known. Yeah.
Is it true? I read in the book, it was they said that there was photography
So your book mentions one photographer in general. He's a good Scholars Bowl name, Matthew Brady. And Matthew Brady he's like the inventor of photojournalism. That he would, like I said, stand on the sideline and he would have the camera set up and, his pictures would show people actually like corpses in the field. And they're stunning photography. I mean, in the way that like large format black and white can only capture it, that for like technological of an era as we live in, our photography isn't anywhere near what Brady could capture on the battlefield. And they were seen as like reporters adjacent to the war. All right, Roman numeral number 11. Are we going to get to this today? You think we can do it? Let's see if we can do it. Let's see if we can finish strong here. After the capture of Vicksburg, the Union Army, James, wake up. The Union Army established regulations for plantation labor. So after the capture of Vicksburg, you have a southern city which has been captured by the North and is under military control. This is constitutional. One of the problems with just abolishing slavery is that the Congress doesn't have the right to do so. The Constitution limits the power of government. But here, it's a military action, and under the powers of the commander-in-chief, the Constitution doesn't apply quite the same way. So the Union Army established regulations for plantation labor. Free people signed labor contracts and earned wages. This was not a popular decision because it basically meant that black people were no longer slaves, but they were forced to sign contracts to go work for the people that just previously enslaved them. And it didn't feel a whole lot like, still felt a lot like slavery. So neither side was really satisfied with this. Subpoint B. In 1863, we're kind of bouncing in the timeline here. In 1863, Lincoln announced his 10% plan for Reconstruction. So Lincoln begins to assume the future of Reconstruction. Hi, Grace. And he's come up with this plan known as the 10% plan, where he says the South, we're going to be fairly lenient with them when they come back in the days after the Civil War. We need to forgive some of this stuff. And with restoring rights and property to people who swear a loyalty oath to the Union. And as soon as 10% of people had sworn the oath, as soon as there are 10% of the people in the state, states could elect a new state government, and one of their first acts needs to be to require to abolish slavery. It's known as the 10% plan. 10% is a shockingly low number, that 90% of the people in the state would not swear loyalty. But if 10% would, Lincoln says that's enough to go bring the states back into the Union. Now, the 10% plan does not include 10% of African Americans. Black people played basically no role in the 10% plan. In New Orleans, free black people there complained at the 10% plan and found sympathy from radical Republicans in Congress. Radical Republicans always trying to push Lincoln further. And radical Republicans passed what's known as the Wade-Davis bill, being one of the most electric closers in the game of baseball in 2014. The Wade-Davis bill was an alternate plan to, which was basically required a majority of the state's voters to pledge loyalty, not just 10%. And Lincoln invents a new technique known as the pocket veto to reject the Wade-Davis plan. The pocket veto, you know what, we always associate it with Lincoln. I don't know if he actually invents it or not. But he says, like, Congress has given me a bill. I am to sign it or to veto it. And he says, I'll look at it later. And he folds it up and sticks it in his pocket. And he just waits on it. And waits. And waits. And waits. And eventually, Congress adjourns. And he's never signed that bill. He hasn't vetoed it. And it doesn't go into law. Now, the Constitution actually says that after 10 days, that bill is going to go into law without the president's signature. But if Congress adjourns first, then the government basically leaves, and the lawmaking body isn't there to go enact the bill over his signature. So Lincoln invents the pocket veto. I don't know if he invents it. We associate it with Lincoln. And so to just he just doesn't veto the bill. He just holds on to it until it kind of solves itself by going away. It's a clever trick, which is why Congress today is always like racing the 10-day deadline for any unpopular legislation. Because in 10 days it goes into effect whether or not the president would sign it. So the president can't pocket veto unpopular things. Subpoint C. Okay, so Sherman took Atlanta. Stay with me, you've got a minute and a half. Sherman took Atlanta and then started what becomes known as Sherman's March to the Sea. This is perhaps the most savage piece of warfare ever on American soil. In Sherman's March to the Sea, he leaves Atlanta to go, so rail hub, to important shipping point in Savannah, Georgia. And in his march to the sea, Sherman lays a scorched earth policy where he has 100-mile wide swath of total destruction. He says, I'm going to cut off the South entirely from shipping the upper South from the lower South on this swath from their rail hub. It's 100 miles wide where he burns every building. Every building, every house, every church, every store, every barn, everything is destroyed. Every field is torched. There is nothing. It is absolutely scorched earth. Every person is killed. Man, woman, child, soldier, baby, every person is killed. Every animal is killed. Every horse, pig, dog, kitten, total scorched earth destruction in Sherman's March to the Sea. It is absolutely savage, and it is to slam the door on any future hopes that the South could keep this going. Sherman, he was quite conflicted by this as a person. When you read Sherman's letters, he is actually a pretty tender person. But he knows in the field of battle the tenderness must be set aside. The scorched earth campaign is to destroy the future hopes. Before we go, the 13th Amendment was approved on January 31st, which abolished slavery in the entire country. In July of 1865, stay with me, in April of 1865, Ulysses S. Grant broke through Robert E. Lee's lines and took the capital of Richmond, Virginia. There, in April of 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant in Virginia at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia on April 9th. Pay attention to this day. On April 9th, he surrenders. On April 14th, 5 days later, Lincoln is shot and killed. Whew. All right, guys. Have a good one.